The 17th and early 18th century saw the meteoric rise of the Kingdom of Sweden, from a small backwards nation to a great Baltic powerhouse. One young king, crowned at the age of 15, would lead this Swedish empire both to the heights of its glory and the depths of its defeat. Join with us as we explore the battles of the Great Northern War. Seeking control of Swedish-owned Baltic territories, the Russian Tsar Peter I forged military alliances with the kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, Poland, Lithuania, and the Elector of Saxony. This combined alliance declared war upon the Kingdom of Sweden, opening up a multi-front war in 1700 against its 18-year-old king, Charles XII. Despite his many foes, young King Charles would strike the first blow of the war in the late summer of 1700, secretly landing troops just north of Copenhagen and forcing Denmark-Norway to sue for peace and abandon the war. As Charles withdrew his troops from Denmark, he received word that a Russian army, led by Peter himself, had marched on the city of Narva in Swedish-controlled Estonia and began work for a protracted siege. The Swedish king quickly rerouted his victorious army to Estonia to lift the siege of Narva. Even with reinforcements from Finland and Estonia, the Swedish army had no more than 10,500 men and 37 cannons, with an additional 2,000 soldiers and 297 cannons contained in the fortress of Narva. Facing them was a Russian army of approximately 37,000 troops and 195 cannons, entrenched in earthworks that ringed the beleaguered city. As the Swedish relief force neared Narva, Charles XII was unsure if the city garrison still held out against the Russians, and so on the eve of the battle, Charles ordered a cannon signal to be fired, and was relieved to hear the same signal echo from the besieged city. The Russian forces also heard the distant cannon fire and sent cavalry to investigate, soon realizing that a small Swedish relief force was approaching. Despite this advanced warning, Peter I left the army in command of Charles Eugene de Croix. The exact reason for his untimely departure is not known, but many historians agree that Peter did not believe the Swedes would attempt an assault against entrenched positions while outnumbered nearly 4-1. Despite the odds, King Charles was confident that his troops could carry the day, and issued orders to attack the Russians the next day, with express instructions that no troops fire until they were within 20 to 30 steps from the enemy. As the night of the 29th gave way to the dawn of the 30th of November, both armies prepared for the approaching conflict. At precisely 10 a.m. of that cold November morning, the Swedish bugle sounded and King Charles, with his 10,500 strong relief force, began their advance towards the Russian positions. The Russian general de Croix marked the advance of the Swedes, but due to the small size of the enemy army, he was convinced that the advancing Swedes were merely a small vanguard, and that a full Swedish attack wouldn't take place until much later, perhaps not even until the next day. Instead of forming up in battle order opposite the Swedish army, the Russian soldiers stayed dispersed along their 4-mile-long front, surrounding the city of Narva. At 2 p.m., after surveying the Russian positions and arraying his troops in a dense shock formation, King Charles XII ordered the attack to commence. In a twist of fate, the weather suddenly turned, and flurries of snow began falling heavily across the battlefield. Despite his officers' request for a delay, Charles pressed his troops forward in 2 large shock formations. The Swedes crashed into the Russian lines, emerging like ghosts out of the snowstorm, firing a volley from no more than 30 paces, and then charging into the Russian positions to engage in a bloody melee. Despite early, determined Russian resistance, within 15 minutes the Swedish troops managed to push through the Russian position at 2 points along their line. And now Charles turned personally, leading half the army north to sweep along the Russian position, while General Otto Velling led the other half of the Swedish army south. One by one, the Russian forces shattered, and soon the panic was spreading along the Russian entrenchments, and the Russian General de Croix hurriedly surrendered to the Swedes, fearing the wrath of his own troops. Other than 2 Russian divisions which doggedly held onto their surrounded positions, the whole northern flank of the Russian army threw down their arms and ran for the rear. As masses of Russian troops desperately fled across the Kamferholm Bridge, the structure failed and collapsed, and with it the only crossing point of the Narva River vanished beneath the frigid waters. The panic became so great that there were reports of Russian soldiers striking down their own officers that attempted to rally them. On the southern flank, the Russian forces managed to maintain a semblance of order under the command of General Wyde, but were unable to break through the Swedish attackers and support the bulk of the Russian forces. Meanwhile, in the north, Charles personally led successive attacks on the final pockets of Russian resistance, but was repulsed, having 2 mounts shot from underneath him in the process. The remaining Russian troops finally surrendered to the exhausted Swedes as the day drew to a close. Despite the odds stacked against them, the Swedish army had prevailed against the Russians, and the siege of Narva was lifted. Despite the complete nature of the victory, King Charles of Sweden agreed to lenient terms, as the number of Russian prisoners was more than double his own army's effective manpower. Roughly 80 Russian officers were imprisoned, while the 20,000 captured infantry were allowed to return home. In all, the Swedish forces captured 145 cannons, 10,000 cannonballs, 397 barrels of gunpowder, and 230 regimental standards. Despite the ferocity of the fight, the Swedish army only suffered light casualties, losing 667 dead and 1,247 wounded. Russian casualties, though difficult to determine, are estimated between 8 and 11,000 dead and wounded, along with another 20,000 captured that were later released. Rarely in military history has such a decisive victory been achieved against the odds. The daring and dashing 18-year-old King Charles would prove himself time and again, just as he had at the Battle of Narva, to be an impressive leader of men. And yet, even in the impressive victory of Narva, the seeds of the ultimate Swedish defeat were sown. As the young king now dismissed the Tsar's forces as capable foes, and instead of driving home his victory against the Russians, Charles turned his eyes south towards the duplicitous Augustus of Saxony and Poland. If you enjoyed this documentary on the Battle of Narva, please consider liking the video as it really helps out the channel. And consider subscribing so that you won't miss the next episode of The Battles of the Great Northern War.